Hi, everyone. Welcome to our final part of our We Are Called Devotion series. This is part 25. Yes, we've done 25 different devotion series about the Old Testament prophets. And this is our final one, looking at part 2 of the prophet Daniel. We'll be talking about chapters 7 through 12. Our reading is from Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 to 14. The prophet says, "As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I watched then, because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. And as I watched, the beast was put to death, and its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed." Here ends the reading. So, yes, I'll bring this devotion series to a close with the last of the chronological prophets, the second half of Daniel. Now, I've called this devotion series We Are Called, and talked about the Old Testament prophets, though it seems like our stories are separated by so much time and space. But these prophets, those who were called by God to speak and act in their time, and we read these stories and learn their histories because they can help us to see our place and our job, since we are called to speak and act in God's ways today. Last week I talked about the first half of the book of Daniel, this couple 100-year jaunt through the history of the world, and the way the Jews had to remember their culture and maintain their religious practices even in the face of hostility and apathy. Now, we don't have to worry about the hostility very much. There are no Christians that are arrested for practicing Christianity in this country right now. But the apathy, both within and without the church, is a major problem for us right now. We just don't care enough about living out our faith. It's easier to just go along with the world, and a world that certainly doesn't care about the Christian faith. But then, neither do we. So we just go along with the world and the culture around us, no matter what that culture is doing. The first part of Daniel talks about how the Jews tried to maintain their religious and cultural patterns while living in surrounding cultures like the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and eventually the Greeks. They would do this by adapting their practices to the culture around them. And sometimes it was through practicing their religion in private. Sometimes it was changing their practices to match the community around them. And sometimes it was through downright refusal to participate in cultural practices that were in conflict. They wouldn't worship other gods, but they would continue to worship God and study their sacred writings in small groups or privately. They would eat some of the food of the culture around them, even if it wasn't listed as a ritually clean food, but some things they still refused to eat. We get all of these ideas wrapped up in nice little stories that are fun to read and still give us these lessons. The second part of Daniel, though, takes another route to teach us about how to survive in this collision of cultures and expectations. And this becomes what we call an apocalypse. Usually we think this word means death and destruction, but that's not at all what it means. It's a Greek word that really means to reveal what is hidden, revelation is a synonym for apocalypse. The image that I've heard for an apocalypse, for an apocalyptic act, is the act of opening the curtains to let the morning sunshine in the house. It's to reveal that which is hidden that makes our lives better. There's really two apocalyptic works in the Bible, this second half of Daniel and then Revelation at the end. There are other apocalyptic pieces, especially the Gospels of Matthew and Mark have a section called A Little Apocalypse. There were also many different apocalyptic works that were written down between the Old and New Testaments. Daniel might be the only Old Testament apocalypse, but in that 300 or so years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, many other apocalyptic works were written to try and help the Jews survive and thrive during the collapse of the Greek culture and the rise of the Roman Empire. Especially interesting are the books of Enoch and the book of Jubilees. The point of an apocalypse is to give us, the reader, a brief glimpse into God's reality so that we can see how God's world affects our world. So the second half of Daniel is a series of visions of what God's world is like. But all the visions Daniel receives have to be translated through his world and his language. So a lot of times it's crazy, strange phrases meant more to explain than define. For example, here he says that he saw an ancient one on the throne, and goes on to describe God as the Greeks always described Zeus. And then he sees one like a human being, or as Jesus will say, the Son of Man, as God's representative on earth who accomplishes God's work. Was there any wonder after reading this part why Jesus used the image of the Son of Man to talk about himself and his work? Apocalyptic writings use many different images to try and show what they are seeing. There's mention here in our reading of great beasts, and describing the enemy as inhuman monsters is a staple of apocalyptic work. Other animals will be exaggerated or described as mixtures of animals, symbolic of all creation. For example, these beasts he talks about here, Daniel had earlier described like, the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Another looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 tusks in its mouth among its teeth. Another was like a leopard that had 4 wings of a bird on its back and 4 heads. These descriptions show how God's creation can go so wrong when we act out of our place and purpose. Meaningful and significant numbers are also common in apocalyptic work, but the numbers are poetic more than literal, which is something we're just not used to. When we think of numbers, we think of exact measurements or specific information. I get numbers all the time, cooking recipes, right? 1 cup of something something. But numbers in the ancient world functioned also as metaphors. You'll see all kinds of numbers throughout Daniel here that don't mean a lot to us, but to him and his first readers meant significant and important ideas, right? Thousands upon thousands, 10,000s times 10,000s. All of these are meaningful metaphors more than exact measurements. The point of this part of Daniel's visions is that no matter how chaotic and confusing and dangerous the world might become, God will remain faithful to the people through it all, until our deaths and even after our deaths. This part of the book leans into the terrifying part of history that happened right after Alexander the Great conquered the world, and then after he died, and his generals then divided the empire, and then they proceeded to fight with each other over the land and power. Daniel is clear that evil will not win in the end. The evils that he sees are these kings and powers that reach and grasp far beyond their role and purpose and function. And Daniel watches the history of all these kingdoms and powers fail and fall. And he knows that every other kingdom will fall in turn until God's kingdom comes to fruition. These apocalyptic visions are designed to show us this simple truth that not a single kingdom, nation, power, ruler, or leader is God. Only God and God's kingdom will survive. Before that time, though, we live in an often violent and despairing world, doing what work we can where we are to see that that eternal kingdom is made real. So much of Daniel, Revelation, and all apocalyptic works are so confusing to us if we don't spend the time to study and research that we can just fall into the trap of taking poetry and meaningful exaggeration as literal description. And this is an insult to the writers, to the scriptures themselves, and to the God who is revealing something to us. Yes, reading and understanding writings like the second part of Daniel take a little bit more work and dedication and imagination, but it's always worth it to rise out of our apathy and delve into these writings and see what God had to say then and how that message is calling out to us here and now to see our own part in God's mission for the sake of the world. And thanks be to God for that.